92 to 95 FM, 810 medium wave, and online, BBC Radio Scotland.
We were all called into a room to be told what we were going to do, and I was told that they had been told to look out for people like me, but they didn't know what I'd be doing, but I'd learn all about it when I went to London. From there, I went to work at Bletchley Parks. It was very, very secret for a long time. Now it's, well, I think it's quite famous.
Jean Rook there, and the sound of a modern replica of Colossus, the first computer designed to crack German codes at Bletchley Park. But what's the Loch Lomond connection? I'm Mark Stephen, and in this programme of Past Lives, your queries have taken us to Dumbartonshire. Today I'm at the foot of Loch Lomond near Balloch, and it is a cracking day. It was just dropping snow on our heads first thing this morning. That's all disappeared. It's clear blue skies reflected in the water, lovely winter colours on the hills, and Ben Lomond up there has got his cap on. It's just pure white up on the top. I'm here with local historian Harry Summers and listener Drew Davidson, whose query brought us here. We're studying our maps and aerial photographs in what's now a holiday camp, but was no holiday camp back in World War II. This was once Tullichewan Castle and Camp, a stately home which was taken over by the armed forces during the war. Drew, what's your question?
Basically, I've got two questions. I was actually born in the camp, so I'm trying to find out about the history of the huts and how it came to be that we were in there in the first place. And the second one was on that I found out that my father-in-law was in the Seabees, or helping the Seabees. He was a cook there.
Right, put this across straight away to local historian Harry Summers. What is the history behind this area?
Yeah, the Seabees were the American Navy's construction battalions. It was the 29th Seabees that came here. They were actually only here for quite a short time. About May 1942, about 300 Americans and probably the same number of Irish labourers arrived to actually build the pipeline from Finnart straight through to O'Kilpatrick. That's why the camp was there. The Americans, as you might expect, made a fantastic impression because they were nearly all, to begin with, they were all civilians, and they were going about in their typical oilmen dress of high heel boots, Levi jeans, which no one had ever seen before, Stetson hats, smoking cigars. So you can imagine that was pretty striking in a place like the Vale of Leven at the time. They were just one step away really from being Hollywood film stars. And I think you would have to say they were also very popular with the ladies. It's a pretty consistent story right through 1942 in the local press of two young girls, obviously not the same two young girls, but it always does seem to be two young girls who are being dragged in front of Dumbarton Sheriff Court for being found trespassing in the Tullichewan encampment.
For some reason unspecified.
Well, actually, the Procurator Fiscal had a wee bit of humour, although the sheriff didn't. But the Procurator Fiscal said, you know, the reasons that there's no security breach, but the reasons for their being there can be left to the imagination. That obviously stretched the sheriff's imagination because he, by December of 1942, he was saying, well, this is becoming increasingly common and it's got to stop, which kind of leaves you wondering what planet he was living in. But certainly they were very popular with the young ladies of the time.
Now obviously when the Americans turned up, they made a huge impact, but after them came a very different group who are barely remembered here. These were the Wrens who came to do their basic training. They were only a short time at Tullichewan, but it left quite an impression on Wren Jean Rook.
Above all else, I shall never ever forget the ablution block as long as I live. It was disgusting. It was obviously purpose-built, a sort of concrete building. You went in, there were loos, I think 3 probably on either side, and on from that there was an open space where there were showers along one wall, no curtains or anything like that. And, you know, that was a long time ago, and we were quite modest in those days. A lot of the girls used to shower with their swimming costumes on because they did not like to strip off absolutely naked in front of strangers, which is understandable. But beyond all of that was the appalling smell, because there were no chains or plugs or anything like that. One just used the loo and it disappeared down below somewhere. And It was so bad that we would do anything to avoid going into the place, and we used to wait all afternoon. So at the end of the day's work, we could rush down to the local station and use the station loo. Believe me, they were a palace compared to that which we had at Tullichewan Castle.
Jean's service took her on to Bletchley Park and then even further afield. For a wee lassie who'd never been out of Scotland before, it was really quite a journey.
Well, I was at Bletchley for a while, and the outstations. A place like Bletchley, you can't have a place on its own. If it was bombed, you'd be in a terrible state. So there were outstations for safety's sake. And after I'd been there for a few months, a notice went up saying the following are required to go overseas. Now, I knew overseas was Ceylon, Sri Lanka as it is now. I was just 19. I wasn't really all that keen about going to sea where there were U-boats and things around, but it did say those underage had to get their father's permission. I went home on leave and said to my father that this, and he said, well, of course you've got permission. You joined up to do your bit, and if that's what they need you to do, that's what you do. He could not be told where I was going, because I was not allowed to say, and so I found myself in Ceylon. I was helping to break Japanese cipher. I was actually helping to break the meteorological code, because that was essential for our aircraft and our ships to know about. And when we had broken it, we sent messages to Melbourne and Honolulu and the Eastern Fleet.
Former Wren Jean Rook. Now, who came after the Wrens?
Well, it would appear that the Wrens left by probably December, certainly late 1944, and the camp and the castle lay unoccupied until about March 1945, when it was recommissioned by the Navy. By June 1946, it had been decommissioned and was lying empty.
But now it enters what, to my mind, is probably the most fascinating phase of all.
Yeah. Well, shortly afterwards, on a Sunday in August 1946, not just this camp, but another one about a mile and a half away at Body Lines in Tullichewan were occupied by the local homeless people.
When you talk about homeless people, we're not talking about vagrants, we're not talking about people, living in the streets or anything like that. We're talking about people who simply had nowhere to stay because of bombing and housing shortages and things like that. They were staying with family or things like that.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. In fact, nearly all of the people who moved in were ex-servicemen with their families. And here at Tullichewan, it was a particularly aggressive takeover because the camp was actually still guarded, albeit very lightly, by the Navy. The first attempt to move in took place in the afternoon, and it was obvious that what they lacked was numbers. So they went and got more numbers, basically, and swept the guards aside, and the guards just stood back. And certainly by the evening, there were 40 to 50 families established in the camp and settled down for the night. That was them until the early 50s, and the last people were still living in the camp in 1953 when they were rehoused in local and other local new local housing estates.
I know you put the question to us, Drew, but I'm fascinated. What do you remember of that early home? It's in a Nissen hut. What sort of condition was it?
Very basic. I remember, as you said, they had to just camp down virtually and squat. My father had just come out of the Navy, so he was very much just trying to get things organised. What I can remember, the internals was just dividing partition walls, and that's all they had, not up to the ceiling, just up so far. Mm-hmm. So they set about just making home with that, making do what they had. It does tell a story of them actually cutting out the side and putting in a side window so they could get some more light into it. But really that's all. I was only a child when we left, so yeah. I can't remember very much about it personally myself.
How did the authorities respond to this, Harry?
The central government didn't have an answer to the housing problem. They said that although these camps were vacant, they weren't actually redundant, and they were for future use. One of the uses that they quoted was that they were going to move Polish troops in there. So you can imagine, here were ex-servicemen just back from the war serving king and country, and they were being told that they couldn't have a house, couldn't even have a home over their heads in many cases. But these camps were going to be given over to foreign troops. That didn't play well.
And there was a real concern too amongst the squatters, as I understand it, that by squatting they might queer their pitch for getting a council house in the future. Did they manage to work their way around that?
Well, they did. In the short term, they were just ignored. But in fact, it took them until 1949, 1950 before they even recognised that there were people there, that they were really council tenants.
You could argue, Drew, that essentially what your parents was doing made them into second-class citizens because
Yes.
they were squatting. Was that a status you were conscious of?
No, not at all.
Just a
Not at
fun
all.
place to grow up.
Well, I was very, as I say, very young, so I don't have any memory at all. My father actually joined the gas board and got a house through the gas board, so we moved out, I think, around about 1950. And I remember my father talking about they were patrolling round the site to make sure that everybody was behaving themselves because they felt that they could get put off the site if there was any carry on. So, and it verges in the fact because they were
Self-policing, basically.
Self-policing and vigilantism, so there was a wee bit of that going on as well.